Hello, how are you? Let me hope you're fine. If you're listening to this, if you're viewing this video, I hope you're going through the situation of coronavirus and we shall manage. Today, I want us to talk about mainly paper one, African nationalism. And I want to make more clarity, or I want to bring out concepts. Before we handle African nationalism, what must we put into consideration? What are the expectations of a teacher? When a student is doing an exam, what do teachers expect you students to do? First, you must note this, that when you are dealing with African nationalism, we must purely discuss it as Africans. But that is not, it is just a personal perception or a concept. However, when attempting a question on African nationalism, we have factors that determined, contributed, that led, that for that gave a platform for the growth and development of African nationalism. These factors are supposed to be discussed in a chronological way, are supposed to be presented chronologically, beginning with what came first, ending with what was the last. So that chronology is what called the order of events. You must note that. You must also note that there are very many individual factors which contribute to the growth and development of African nationalism. There are very many factors. For example, talk about the Asian independence or independence of India. Talk about the Second World War. Talk about the role played by USA and USSR, the rise of superpowers. Talk about Egypt. Talk about the independence of Ghana. All those factors can act as independent. And so you must be aware, you as a student, you must be aware of these factors individually and how they contribute to the growth and development of African nationalism. Putting that aside, we must be aware of two-sided questions and one-sided questions and the time frame. They can ask a question, account for the growth and development of African nationalism, or account for the development of African nationalism since 1940 or 1945. That time frame, that limitation which has been put by an examiner means that we are going to discuss factors beginning from 1945 up to. An examiner can say, examine the factors for the growth and development of African nationalism by 1960 or 1963. So we begin with what came first until 1963 as the time frame has been given by the examiner. I understand and I believe that we all know we don't have special things that we must note about African nationalism or factors of African nationalism, but we must know that when European states decided on to come and settle in Africa, even before the 1885 scramble for and partition of Africa, some European powers were already in Africa. European powers like uh, uh, European powers like the French in Algeria. They came in Algeria in 1830 altogether. So some European powers had come already in Africa. But on the eve of their coming to Africa, they carried with themselves, or they came along with policies, which policies were not in Africa but were brought by these Europeans and were introduced in Africa in very many states. A case in point, the settlement of the French in Algeria, that is North Africa, led, or these French introduced very many policies, what we call colonial administrative policies. For example, taxation, where Africans were supposed to pay tax to the French in Algeria. The French still in Algeria introduced some other policies. Restriction of movements. They introduced, they decampaigned African, actually the matters of religion. Remember, Algerians were Muslims, and you know how Muslims behave. The way of life of Muslims: you don't take alcohol. It is prohibited to take pork. But the French, who were Christians, came along with behaviors, dressing, miniskirts, alcoholism. These contaminated. They were contrary to the way of life of the Algerians. And we see that it is these policies in very many states, even in Kenya, we had the policies of the British. For example, we had the policies of the Chipande system, the policies of overtaxation, the policies of forced labor. All these policies are the policies which forced Africans in Africa now to demand for self-rule, to feel independent, to demand for self-rule from the colonial powers. And this is now the time African nationalism is becoming strong, the love for their independence. So nationalism being the love that Africans had for their countries, matters, independence, and free from colonialism, was spearheaded by the failure of European states to follow or to respect the courage of Africans, to respect the African dignity, by introducing policies which were contrary to the African way of life. The unfairness which they exhibited, matters in education, matters in public service or public works. So these policies forced Africans. But we say that in African nationalism, it is not only policies or things within Africa that inspired Africans to grow nationalistic, but even things outside Africa, especially in Asia. And that is why we say that there were inspirations outside Africa. There were physical contributions outside Africa altogether that made Africans believe that colonialism could be defeated and independence was a must. And this is what makes us historians believe that African nationalism, or the love of Africa, was not a myth. And we are going to see why did Africans grow nationalistic? What factors? What was behind this. And in our next edition, we are going to be talking about how African nationalism became, actually, what factors were behind the growth and development of nationalism in Africa, beginning with the colonial policies until 1975, actually 1974. Are we together? A short break as we come back. Thank you. I remain Tebucha Morshid. Goodbye.